Why do some priests... What's the question? My name is Father Scott Bailey. I am a priest of the Archdiocese of Denver, and this is What Catholics Believe About the Priesthood. What is a priest? A priest is a man who has been ordained through the sacrament of holy orders for sacred ministry. So this means that a priest is involved in celebrating the sacraments, for example, and they're involved in preaching and has general care for the spiritual life of the faithful. Is the priesthood in the Bible? The priesthood is all over the Bible. For sure, in the Old Testament, you see the Old Testament priesthood. The priests in the Old Testament, they had the primary task of offering sacrifices to the Lord. So they might sacrifice a lamb, for example, right? The lamb is a sacrifice. The priest is the one who offers the sacrifice. Jesus is the fulfillment of that priesthood, right? Jesus is the sacrifice. He's the lamb who is sacrificed. And he's also the priest who's offering the sacrifice. So Jesus is the fulfillment of that Old Testament priesthood. And then Jesus, at the Last Supper, establishes a ministerial priesthood, we would say, in the life of the church. He gives men this ability to offer that same sacrifice of himself. So we see Jesus giving us the priesthood in the Gospels. We see the priesthood represented in the Acts of the Apostles. We see it in some of the letters of the New Testament as well. I think in particular of James chapter 5. We have that line in there where St. James says, "If there's anyone sick among you, call for the priests of the church, and the priest will come and pray over the person, anointing them with oil in the name of the Lord, and the prayer of faith will save the sick persons." So we see priests, not just in the Old Testament, but we see the ministerial priesthood, this Christian priesthood present throughout the New Testament. What is the role of a Catholic priest? Catholic priest's role is rather broad, I guess you could say, and it might even depend on the priest's particular assignment. I would say big picture, the role of a priest is to help people to encounter the Lord. It's to be in a role of service for the life of the church. So that might look different depending on what kind of an assignment a man is in. So a man who's serving in the seminary, teaching in the seminary, his way of living out the priesthood is going to look a little bit different than my way of living out the priesthood at a parish with almost 2,000 families. Big picture, generally, when it comes to the ministry of a priest is offering sacraments. So I'm celebrating Mass, I'm hearing confessions, I'm anointing people in their hospital rooms. I'm spending a lot of time one-on-one with people, talking about their spiritual lives. So sometimes that is in the conversation of confession or the tragedies going on in their life, processing death, that sort of thing. And then there's an element of my job is to help people to encounter the Lord more deeply. So sometimes that means I may need to teach a class on occasion, or I may need to show up at religious education and try to build relationships with some of the children. My role is to be a spiritual father for other people. And that's going to look different given the circumstances and the parish and the people that I'm working with. Why can't women be priests? This is a controversial question sometimes. It's a question that's come up a lot of times in the last 100 years, maybe specifically in the last 50 years. I think sometimes it comes from a place of expecting that the church doesn't care for women, or there's somehow an unjust discrimination here. From a Catholic perspective, though, we've been saying for a long time that the church really doesn't have the freedom to ordain women to the priesthood. And that's for three reasons, I would say. First of all, it's not present in the scriptures. We don't see Jesus ordaining women in the scriptures. We don't see reference to women as ordained priests in the scriptures. So that'd be the first thing. The second thing would be sacred tradition. Remember, we hold together scriptures and sacred tradition. This is the deposit of the faith. This is divine revelation. It's also not present in sacred tradition. We don't see this happening at any point in history. And then you have the teaching authority of the church, which we call the magisterium. And the magisterium has been consistent on this all the way through history, that it is not possible to ordain women to the priesthood. We can see Jesus throughout the Gospels highlights the importance of women. We see women following Jesus when that would have not been terribly common for rabbis to be followed by women followers. Jesus was already breaking with kind of the traditions of his time by having women followers and giving women like Mary Magdalene the role of going and sharing the news of the resurrection with the apostles. And so women have an important role in the church. And St. John Paul II, in particular, has been so emphatic of the importance of women having important roles of sharing the gospel with others and helping to find leadership within the life of the church to help all of us to grow closer to the Lord and to live lives of holiness. So while the church says that it has no freedom when it comes to ordaining women to the priesthood, the church consistently reminds us of the importance and the beauty and the dignity of the vocation of women in the life of the church. Why do some priests look like Jedi in their cool robes and other priests don't? In a lot of ways, this is probably going to just come down to personal preference for a lot of priests. The long cassock, I think, is what's being referred to here. It's a long black robe, I suppose you could call it, that a priest would wear. It's got buttons all down the front. Sometimes it's worn with a sash over the front. This is kind of a traditional clothing that you would see priests wear throughout history. Nowadays, I'm not wearing that. I'm wearing a tab shirt, we would call this. But for the most part, it's going to be just a preference of the priest. What style does he wish? I like to wear that cassock when I'm going to formal affairs. If I'm going to a wedding reception, for example, or to a fundraiser event, I'm inclined to wear the cassock because I think it looks very nice. But for myself, the day-to-day clothing tends to be what I'm wearing today. There are some religious orders where wearing a cassock would actually be the norm for some of the priests. And then there's other religious orders that will wear different kinds of habits. So you might look at a Dominican and they wear a beautiful white habit with maybe a black belt and rosary beads hanging from the side. You might see Franciscans wearing a brown habit with a white rope, that sort of thing. So different religious orders can wear different vestments, but you'll usually see that long black cassock on diocesan priests and the occasional religious order. How do you become a priest? First of all, you'd have to qualify for the priesthood. That would be something that you're going to have to discuss with a vocations director at a diocese or something like that if you're looking into the priesthood. But the journey is going to look a little bit different, maybe depending on the diocese. But there's going to be a time of seminary formation. There's a time of studying philosophy for almost everybody, a time of studying theology. There's a lot built into the whole seminary experience. It's not just an intellectual formation thing. We're trying to form an entire person here. So we call it formation more than education. We're trying to form a man in a prayer life, in a moral life, help him to get exposed to the different types of ministry that he might be involved in. I spent time in a jail. I spent time in a nursing home. I spent time teaching at a parish. Try to get a little feel for all the different ways in which, as a priest, you might be serving. And then at the end of the seminary experience, towards the end, there's an ordination to the diaconate first. This is a ministry of service. So the man gets some experience doing things like baptisms and funerals and weddings and hopefully getting some experience preaching. Some of those a little more experience of the things that will come with the priesthood, but it's specifically focused on being a servant. And then comes priestly ordination. There's a very important point in that ordination mass where the bishop lays his hands on the man's head and he prays in silence. And then he prays this long prayer of ordination. And those two things combined is the moment in which the man becomes a priest. And then he's vested with the vestments. And there's these little symbolic things that will happen in the course of the mass, like when he's handed the chalice and he's handed a paten. They've got the wine and the bread ready to go for that mass. And the bishop says this line that I just love. He says, to the newly ordained priest, receive the oblation of the holy people to be offered to God, understand what you do, imitate what you celebrate, and conform your life to the mystery of the Lord's cross. It's such a profound moment in the ordination rite. I think that's why I've memorized it. Like, it means so much that in that moment, the priest is, yes, receiving bread and wine, but they represent the bigger offering of the people of God. And this is what his life is going to be, is receiving the sacrifices of the people, offering them to the Lord, and then transforming those gifts back to give to the people as the Eucharist. So it's a long journey and it's going to have its ups and its downs, but it's a journey that, if the Lord is calling a man to it, is going to end in something really beautiful in his ordination to the priesthood. I would say if anyone is thinking about becoming a priest, for any young men who are considering that, first of all, go talk to your local priest. Get to know the priest at your parish and talk a little bit about it with him. Learn a little bit about the priesthood by just spending time with him, and maybe even allow him to speak a bit into your own spiritual life as you go through that discernment journey. And through all of that, you'll begin that process of knowing what's the Lord's voice, what's your own idea, and maybe the Lord will start to nudge you in the direction of talking to your diocese and moving forward with an application to the seminary. Do Catholic priests get paid? That depends on the priest. And it depends probably on where you are in the world. In the United States, probably all of your diocesan priests are going to get paid. Diocesan priests do not make a vow of poverty, so that just means that we're allowed to own things. I'm allowed to have my own cell phone and my own shoes and that sort of thing. For those priests who belong to a religious order, they do take a vow of poverty. So those things that they're allowed to use aren't actually theirs, so they don't even get to take a paycheck. So it depends on where you are. And even in certain parts of the world, diocesan priests don't always get paid. I know a priest from a certain part of Asia who, when he is serving in that country, he doesn't get paid other than what comes up in the offertory. So at the offertory at Mass, when people bring up rice or they bring up a chicken, then that goes to the priest. That is his payment. That is to help sustain his life, because he's not going to get a paycheck in the way that he would get if he's serving here in the United States. So it all depends on the circumstances and where you're living. Why did I become a priest? As a seminarian, we get asked all the time what our vocation story is. As a priest, people don't ask as often. For years, it was an idea kind of in the back of my head for myself, that maybe the Lord would be calling me to this. But I had another idea. I had something else that I kind of wanted to do with my life. But as I grew in my spiritual life and I was studying the Catholic faith, that was a real tension that I had when I started college, was a tension between do I believe the Catholic faith or not? Or I needed to understand what it is that I was raised with, and I needed to understand what the Catholic faith held. And the more I studied, man, the more I fell in love with it. The more I wanted to be Catholic, and I wanted to talk about my Catholic faith. And in the process of that, and I'm growing in my spiritual life, I started to recognize the Lord leading me little by little. And it got to the point that I was convinced that he wanted me to enter seminary. I wasn't yet convinced he wanted me to be a priest, but I knew he wanted me to enter seminary. And that was actually significant for me in my experience, even of seminary life. Seminary, for me, was 7 years long. I had plenty of time to discern whether or not the Lord wanted me to be a priest. And for me, every semester, it came down to the end of the semester, I would ask the Lord, Lord, do you still want me to be here? And most of the time, the Lord was just giving me enough guidance of stay another semester, stay another semester. He wasn't always giving me the whole big picture of what my whole life was going to hold yet. I didn't yet know for sure that I was called to be a priest, but I knew I was supposed to be in the seminary for a little bit longer. So the Lord walked with me. He was very patient with me in leading me towards the priesthood. And when my will finally came in line with his will, those last couple of years of seminary were a delight, and the priesthood has been far more beautiful than anything I could have imagined. Like every vocation, the priesthood has its ups and downs, and some days are easier than others, and sometimes a priest just isn't always on his A game. And one thing I've just experienced is it's important for people to be praying for their priests, for their well-being, first of all, their spiritual life in particular, and to just have patience on priests. We try, but we're very frequently in the public eye. Even on our day off, I still get caught at the grocery store and having another conversation with somebody about their life or something like that. And so it's hard sometimes to have a day off, and that can be hard for a lot of priests. And so I would just ask people to just be patient and to continually pray for your priests. I would say on the whole, most of us priests know that we're loved by our people, but it's not always expressed. We are often there for other people, or we're trying to be there for other people. And so I love those days when people after Mass, the little thank you for that homily, but if they're specific about it, if you want to thank your priest for anything, be specific in what you're grateful for, not just thank him for a nice homily, but tell him what you liked about the homily. And to try to be specific with what your priest in your parish likes. Say something that would be meaningful specifically for him, because you know his heart. That can be one of the harder things of being a public person, I'm sure, in general. But the need for the priest to know that he's noticed in the sacrifices he's offering. The meaning of the word priest is to be the one who offers sacrifice. And the priest offers the sacrifice that is Jesus in the sacraments in particular. But there's sacrifices that come with the life of a priest. And sometimes we just need to know that the sacrifice is noticed. And those prayers and those little signs of support go a long way. Thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this little video. And please pray for your priests, because I guarantee you they're praying for you. God bless you.